Hello, everybody. Welcome to Community Conversations. My name is Courtney Shaw. I am the facilitator here. A couple of announcements. We have one more week after this. Elena Ross is going to be talking about outdoor Pacific Northwest adventures next week, so please join us for that. We are on hiatus for winter quarter, but we will be back in the spring, so keep an eye out on our website for more details about that. That's lowercolumbia.edu/conversations. That's also where you can go and watch recordings of previous events. And so if you just can't stand the thought of going 3 months before you get more community conversations, we have a large archive of all sorts of wonderful talks that you can listen to. Today, we are doing our second partnership with Northwest Voices. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome Chris Tower, who's going to introduce our guest and talk about some of the events that Northwest Voices has going. So please welcome Chris Tower.
Hi, everybody. So I am Chris Tower, Director of Northwest Voices, and we're so excited today to bring Sarah Marshall to our campus and community, which I'll introduce you to her in a minute. But I want to mention that right after this, so about 12:45 after a break, we're going to have a workshop in this room, and we'll invite many of you to move forward, so it's a little more intimate perhaps, and then at 5:30 over in the Longview Public Library, as we partner with them for Northwest Voices, they'll be reading from 5:30 to approximately 6:30. I cannot tell you about our events for next year yet because they're not all thoroughly booked, but we are not taking a hiatus, so there'll be author events in the winter and again in the spring. I am so excited to bring Sarah Marshall to our campus. She is the host of a podcast that won Best Podcast of the Year last year by iHeart Podcasts. It's called You're Wrong About. It originally started with a reporter from the Huffington Post named Michael Hobbs, who was her co-host till about 2021. And still comes back for guest spots. So I just recently listened to an episode about The Sound of Freedom, which is a movie this summer, and a rebroadcast of a human trafficking episode from, I don't know what year that was. Yeah, some year previously. A few other things. So You're Wrong About went on the road this year and did a spring tour throughout the East Coast. And Sarah was featured all over the place. I was watching this morning all these news clips from TV talk shows in Pittsburgh and out in other places out east, and then there were articles in Time Magazine and the New Yorker and elsewhere. She also does she co-hosts a podcast called You Are Good with Alex Steed, which is dubbed as a feelings podcast about movies. And that's another place you can find out what's going on. Now, You're Wrong About is a podcast that is a history lesson, a media critique, and a meditation on the ephemeral nature of the truth, according to Time Magazine. It is a place in which Sarah gets to talk about some of her things that really that matter to her, such as how the media has kind of roadkilled certain women, a term that she herself used in a podcast I recently listened to, maligned and alleged monsters. And this comes from an interest almost 10 years ago in which she published 11,000 word sort of correction of the story of Tonya Harding, long before the I, Tonya movie. And that's just one of many articles that Sarah's written, including articles about Anna Nicole Smith, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Newsies, which everything relates to, as we recently found out in an episode. So without further ado, everyone, Sarah Marshall. So so I have to confess that I didn't know your podcast or anything. So someone recommended that we might want to bring you in for Northwest Voices. And so, of course, I started listening to your podcast. I mostly listen to audiobooks. Not that I'm averse to podcasts, but, I'm busy with audiobooks. And, just immediately loved what you're doing. And as I started to go back through some of the more recent ones, I saw that, like, back in April, you did one on Sinead O'Connor. And I was like, oh, my gosh, how, like, weirdly prophetic. And I noticed that at the beginning of some of the podcasts, and maybe this is something you've done a lot because I haven't been able to listen to all of them, but The recent ones, there's these, you'll clip, you and Carolyn Kendricks, a producer, will clip something that you say, right after startup music. Like that one was something like women weren't allowed to be angry till about 1992. And then, so was there any like follow up after Sinead O'Connor passed away to the episode?
I'm not, can people hear me, by the way? Is this good? Perfect. All right. Yeah, I'm not active on social media at all anymore because I spent all of my social media hours for the rest of my life on it in 2020 and 2021. And now I have to take a break or I'll die. But probably, I mean, I think, and I also have to give credit for the timing of that to Alison McCabe, because she was my guest and she had come out with a wonderful book on Sinead O'Connor and on kind of connecting with her music and then connecting with her legacy as a person who was, flattened into a very tiny moment that then got replayed endlessly, and sort of how do you go through that to find the full complexity of the actual human being. But I mean, that was also a topic that I would give credit for the timeliness of to everyone who listens to the show, because people have been requesting that from, I think, day one. If not literally day one, then certainly literally day 5.
Yeah, because like she's kind of a poster person for that kind of maligned by the media. And you cover that really well in the episode. You do the thing with the Saturday Night Live episode where she tears up the picture of the Pope, which I didn't know until I haven't read her memoir, Sinead O'Connor's memoir, but it's on my audiobook stack. But that was her mom's picture of the Pope. So it was really significant to her when she tore it up for a different way. But you covered all that. And it seems kind of fit with all the different women that get targeted by both the media and the public for sort of hate. And so talk about any of them. Like I was going through, you got Kitty Genovese, which you did several episodes about, which I didn't know much about that one. Of course, Tonya Harding, Anna Nicole Smith, Amy Fisher, and then as I put on the picture there, Monica, Janet, Tonya, and Anna Nicole, and I had to actually Google. I was pretty sure that probably referenced Janet Jackson and the whole Super Bowl thing, but I wasn't positive until I did some Googling and found some other articles that way. So, in a way, this is introducing you to the audience. So to try to get them to encounter some of the things you've done, talk about any of those. Whomever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Tonya Harding was my fixation from early adulthood. I think it was when I was 22. And so I was starting to do an MFA program at PSU, which had kind of just been created. And suddenly I had all these friends who were moving to the area from all over the country. And we're kind of trying to figure out, what is Portland about and what is the Northwest about? And it was 2010. And so the idea was that it's like this very kind of, I don't know, that was when the city of Portland was like, yes, we're so dumb, make fun of us. At least you're talking about us. We love that. Which I found mortifying. And I was like, you know what Portland is about? Portland is about Tonya Harding. And then many people were like, what's that? And that kind of launched me on that quest, which was, and I think that this is, especially now as media from when we were growing up becomes so much more accessible to return to. I think that it maybe is kind of a rite of passage for a lot of people to look at the sort of media sleigh ride that they were just kind of on as a younger person, because that was a story that the culture was interested in the moment. You just kind of get caught up in the crowd. And looking back, trying to understand what it was all about. And for me, that was something I especially took part in, kind of looking at people who have been really vilified or seen as kind of monstrous figures and looking at what bothered us most about them. Because often what bothered us most, especially if the monster in question is not a man, because the list of my subjects you read is like serial killers, if they're male serial killers, and women who made some bad choices at some point and had some tacky looks, some big fluffy bangs. We hate that as much as murder. It's kind of a double standard. But trying to see kind of what was there and what that's telling us about what the culture was reacting to. And so Tanya Harding was somebody that I remembered very vaguely. I had been 6 going on 7 during the 5 going on 6 during the Olympics here, when Tanya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan was simply all anyone was allowed to talk about in the news for a good 6 weeks, and then we all moved on. And knowing that she had, that had been like Tanya Harding and Keiko were like the 2 people/animals in the 90s who brought national news media to Oregon when we weren't really used to that. So they were the protagonists of that decade. And what was so fascinating to me is, as a young woman, kind of, trying to understand not just how to build a career for myself, but also how to exist in a world that felt very ambivalent about me and people like me. And so many of the people trying to find a home in it was figuring out what she had done that was so wrong. And what's interesting is that the connection, the idea of her doing something explicitly criminal, there was only ever kind of sketchy circumstantial evidence connecting her to that. And that she kind of was remembered, and this gang of horrible men directly behind her we managed to forget about and not know by name. And so that was just really fascinating to me, and I never quite got off of it.
Well, and one of the things you mentioned, and I don't remember if I got this out of the article or from one of the videos I watched this morning, which was that a lot of the vilification seemed to focus on what she looked like, Tanya Harding, and especially in comparison to Nancy Kerrigan, and that seems to be something that is a theme with other women, either what they look like or redefining white trash, which is something that you pointed out about Anna Nicole Smith from an article in New York Magazine. That seems to be this sort of superficial reaction of the public to dismiss these people without empathy or compassion. And it seems to be something that you mentioned about, I have a quote here somewhere, but I don't know if I'll find it. Something you mentioned about why people like your podcast, which is that not so much that they feel scolded by getting these like sort of corrections about the way we think about these stories from the past, but that it helps them to connect to other humans and feel some kind of empathy for them. And so can you talk a little about that in relation to Tanya or any of these stories that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of, I was visiting my mom last night, and my dad died last year. And so my mom and I are divided on how to deal with that, because I think that you should go to therapy and talk about your feelings a lot. And my mom thinks you should just stuff it down and then read something. And so she was like, I read this article in the New England Journal of Medicine about grieving. You should read that. And I was like, oh my God, more homework. But she was telling me about it. She was like, it's by this doctor, and all 3 of his wives died. And I was like, maybe he's a serial killer. And then she was telling me about it more, and I was like, maybe he should move because they all died of cancer, ALS. And then I was like, isn't that interesting? Like, I just did the 2, like the classic reflex of like hearing about something horrifying that happened to someone else, blame them for it, blame their choices for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was joking, but that's still like, that's what I think my brain does, that very automatically. And I have to assume other people's do too, because the idea of, Tanya Harding is such a good example of that, because if you, take the more complex view of it, which like so much more culture has in the last 10 years and has about people in her position, and kind of radiating outwards toward, other figures who the media historically doesn't empathize with at all. It's like, you can see why it's so much easier to take the view that, she had brought this all on herself, and part of it was through her lack of obedience to the cultural norms that are keeping all of us safe by following. So why can't she do it? Right. And that if you were to look at it more complexly, you see this unbelievably depressing story about someone who could do something that basically no one else in the world could do, but who still had no self-esteem because she'd been in abusive relationships for her entire life. And therefore, if she did make a terrible choice, did it out of, I think, passiveness and desperation, and out of the fairly accurate sense that the sport she was so good at didn't really care in many cases how good she was because her thighs had too big of a circumference. It feels like a very natural human reflex to want to protect yourself from the idea that something bad could, become a view or your life by distancing things that way. And that then it is like the harder thing often to kind of sit with it and ease into it. And also that I don't feel like I'm going to get anywhere by being angry at people for not doing that when our lives are hard and we only have 30 seconds to digest most news stories.
Right. And so when you say this thing that nobody else could do that she could do, are you referring to the triple? I gotta admit, I don't know figure skating very well, but the triple axel.
Yeah.
And so what is that exactly? What is it?
Oh, thank you.
I know you love skating. You mentioned it multiple times in your podcast.
Yeah. So the triple axel is interesting because up until the 80s, women didn't really have to do triple jumps at all in competition to be serious on the senior level. Dorothy Hamill was, I'm pretty sure, the last woman to win an Olympic gold medal without any kind of triple jump, but she did have a couple of double axels, which was pretty athletic. And so the triple axel at the time, Tanya was doing them, the first woman, and when she was competing, the only other woman who could land them in competition was Midori Ito, who was competing for Japan, and who had a very dramatic 1992 Olympics, where she ended up placing silver, and then I think leaving the sport after that. And so basically, every other jump you enter into going backwards, you're skating, building up speed, and then you turn, you use the kind of pick on the front of your skate to launch yourself into the air, and then you spin 2 or 3 times, and then you land backwards as well. And so the triple axel is harder because you're taking off facing front and then landing it backwards. So you have to get out another half a rotation while taking off from a position that also makes it harder to gain height because you're basically leaping from a flat foot. And so you have to be extremely powerful and extremely muscular in order to do it.
And yet you made the comment about her thighs being too big around, and she have to have the muscle to be able to do something like that. But she's compared to this standard that's completely unrealistic.
Right. And maybe she likes to have a picture after practice, and that's her right as well. And yeah, skating is fascinating because it's, as far as I can tell, like the sport where you can see, I think all sports are in one way or another about gender pretty clearly, but that skating is one where like you have an artistic score, which is, the way the scoring system changed in 2002. So it's now more complicated than it used to be, but it has a similar breakdown of components. And that within the artistic score, the impression score, like a judge does have wiggle room to be like, I just don't like her. I don't like that. I don't like it.
Yeah, you write about that in the article, how that part of the scoring system was incredibly subjective and seemed to be a good place where people's inherent, sort of sexist reactions to things would or just prejudicial, if not, really sexist, would come out. And that was the difference between the way Tanya was regarded and the way Nancy Kerrigan was regarded. That was I thought really fascinating in your article.
Thank you.
So, but then compared to that, some of the other women that you've written about, like Anna Nicole Smith, were just caught up in sort of circumstances in which, as you described in the video I watched, where you're talking about the article you wrote, that, she was sort of hounded by this rich man to marry her. And then eventually, after putting him off over and over again, gave in because it seemed, like a reasonable option. And he seemed really driven to want to marry her. And yet that's not the narrative. That wasn't the public narrative.
Yeah, which is fascinating to me because I definitely grew up watching her on TV and kind of taking part in the public sort of audience for the sideshow thing of like, oh my God, how dare this bimbo have the audacity to pursue her gold digger money all the way to the Supreme Court. And again, like she's someone who I loved writing about because I feel like I stared at that story for so long that like everything sort of melted. And like when you forget why we all agreed to hate somebody and can't like find the reason anymore, it's kind of fascinating because I was just like, I think that she should get the money from the oil millionaire who told her he wanted to give her his money. I think that's fair. He was a consenting adult. She married him. She had sex with him. Is this not work? Does she not deserve this money at least as much as his hideous millionaire descendants, you know?
And was there a child also?
Well, she had a son when they got married.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. That's from a previous situation.
But and that's, you know, a great motivation to marry a guy who's like, please let me give you my money. Like, you have a kid to take care of. It's so strange to think of, you know, seeing, if I were trying to be a good mother to my child, I would not on general principles insist on continuing to work at Red Lobster, you know?
Yeah, when you have an alternative, you know.
Right. And like, that's, I don't know. And this kind of feels like it fits into the idea that like, it was wrong of her to take money that was offered to her by someone who had plenty of money to offer, because it's good to work hard for the money, so hard for it, honey. And that like,
Song.
because there's, right. So it's, you know, it has to be true if it's an Donna Summer song, but that like, you know, and then you like, it's moments like that, I feel like, when you kind of see how deep the sort of Puritan work ethic has seeped into everything we know. And just the idea that there is some kind of higher moral value to suffering more for the resources you're able to get.
Well, yeah. Now that I love that you brought that up, because it's something that I've thought about for a really long time, that America's never really gotten away from those Puritan roots. And I noticed in something I was reading that you, in your studies, were originally looking at women's captivity in colonial America and these myths of young girls possessed by demons, as just a reaction, like a panic reaction to the increasing independence of young girls and women during that time period.
Mhm.
So does that relate to a lot of the other stories that you've been focusing that idea, like a lot of these stories?
Oh yeah, totally. And something I'm kind of working on now is this concept that I'm calling strange phenomena, which I like to name things after Kate Bush songs when it's at all available. And
That's a great idea.
right. And that you can kind of see this through line throughout history, and kind of showing how much things have not changed, that like, especially as an adolescent girl in America, like it historically has been famously extremely hard to be listened to by anyone, because you're not reliable, because your uterus wanders all over your body, and who can trust that? But that you could be listened to if you pretended someone else was speaking through you. And in a case like Elizabeth Knapp in 17th century Massachusetts, that was saying that the devil had taken possession of you and now was insulting your boss. And then in the spiritualist movement started inadvertently by the Teenage Fox sisters in upstate New York in the 19th century, it meant proving your relevance by saying that you could have the spirit of Ben Franklin speak through you. And that's, you know, just remains, I think, that hasn't gone away, and that we don't have massive seances that people pay to attend, but that we have, you know, still, I mean, and this is, I get a lot of emails complaining that I say the word like too much. And honestly, I think they're right. I do say it too much, but I also extemporize for a living, and I just haven't gotten around to working on it actively. We had a pandemic, and I was distracting.
Oh.
I was saying like too much before that, but I'm going to blame it on that. I'm okay with the inconsistency. And but like what people often mean, or even explicitly say in these emails, is no one will listen to you if you keep talking like this. You sound like a teenage girl, and therefore I don't believe you. And I guess my question is, why can I not sound like a teenage girl? And also, thank you, because I do not look like one.
Well, and you know, teenage girls, you know, have a lot to say. I think we should listen to them. I think we should listen to everybody, you know, like what kind of a ridiculous comment is that? Anyway, actually, it's funny because I was looking at some of the review comments to some of your podcasts, and like I had listened to, I'm sorry, I listened to the Sound of Freedom episode, that then you did the rebroadcast to the human trafficking episode with Michael. And there's this woman that got on like, you must do your research better because, you know, if you just look into it a little more, this human trafficking is going on and you're making fun of it. You're making jokes about it. And I was thinking to myself, did she actually listen to the episode? You know, like you're debunking. Is that you get around to saying at one point, like, obviously human trafficking happens and there's these terrible stories. And you bring up, you and Michael had done a ton of research. It was quite obvious. And so had you. And you know, talking about you know, those horrible stories, but then also debunking all the you know, the things that weren't true, like the what's the New England Patriots owner, Robert Kraft, is that, you know, and that whole scandal from last year in the was it in Florida or Atlanta?
It's so many scandals ago. I
Yeah,
don't
there's
even remember. I'm sorry.
yeah, and our scandals last less time now
Yeah.
than they did in the Tanya
Lucky
Harding
if we
era.
got 6 days at this
If
point.
that,
Yeah.
6 minutes
Yeah.
maybe, you know. So yeah, do you get a lot? So obviously you're trying not to pay attention to that because you're off social media because you used up your
My
minutes,
hours,
you know,
yeah.
your minutes and hours in 2020, 2021. But you also mentioned in one podcast that you don't engage with those reviews and those comments.
Yeah.
Is that still
Oh yeah.
true unless they directly email you?
Even if people directly email me, I'm just, I don't know. And this is like, we're all different in this way, but I think I've accepted that I'm very weak and fragile and I just don't want to read people being mad at me.
No.
And if I fuck
No, I
up,
get that.
then, you know, I should know about that. And I do, you know, learn that from people saying this, you know, factually there's a problem here, or this is
Sure.
a perspective you haven't encountered, because I have, you know, people who run social media for me and who can tell me about when that comes up. But that, you know, there, I think above a certain scale of being heard by people that you don't know, like it just becomes an unprocessable amount of information. And I feel like we are living in a period when we kind of, technology now has a much greater capacity to bring us information than the capacity we have to process it in any real way. And I feel like increasingly like I don't want to be online at all. Like I find it exhausting to have a phone, and just to sort of the number of sort of like it feels like being an air traffic controller sometimes to be texting people, because you have like 3 or 4 conversations going. You're like, please divert and land in Dallas. And I don't know, I feel some concern over like the amount of noise and you know, just information, or not even information, just sort of attention seeking content that we kind of need to deal with each day. Because I feel like, I don't know, I don't think that human beings are ever going to suddenly evolve to get better at thinking critically. Like we clearly are like really punching above our weight in kind of in any situation we're in. But I don't think it's helping.
No, and I routinely play, as I mentioned, so I had to start up the Fleetwood Mac because I routinely play music in class because it doesn't feel like I'm doing my job unless music is going, except when I turn it off so they can hear me talk. But I always played The Police's Too Much Information because it seemed really prophetic, and I used to, you know, talk a lot about that, you know, that overload, because I told you that my phone is, you know, like best way to get me is to call me because I silence my phone from all those beeps and things and chimes and whatnot, because I can't stand it just constantly going off like that, right? But there was something I was going to shift into. Oh yes, so this is big for you because as I read online, your podcast is routinely downloaded 3.25 to 4 million times a month. So that's the number of downloads. It's in the top 100 podcasts. That's why it won the Podcast of the Year award last year by iHeart Podcasts, and it was one of only 4 indie podcasts in the top 50 in 2021, which means that you're still producing it yourself with Carolyn Kendrick and other people that work with you, and you haven't been gobbled up by, say, like Spotify or any of that. So how's that going?
It's going great because some large corporation isn't taking all my money, and I think that
Oh.
this is one of the, the weird things about podcasts is that there is, a fairly low barrier to entry, but then having the kind of the resources broadly to be able to continue long enough to be found by listeners, I think is one of the really difficult parts. And it feels like, and the gold rush is certainly dwindling in this respect, but there was a period where if you had any kind of a show that had some kind of a listenership, was doing well, there was a feeling by one of the larger podcast networks that you could be profitable to them, then you would be sort of sucked up and they would, in that deal, own your intellectual property. That was true for every network that we talked to, and we talked to pretty much all of them at one point or another. And we were open to joining a network. There just weren't any of them where they could say to us outright, like, we will not, suck all the juice out of what you do and take control of it and take most of the profits from it.
So there wasn't creator ownership and you retain ownership of your intellectual property. You would have to give up a lot of that to have this bigger support. Like, what would they offer in return for being the big gobble up, the big fish that would eat you?
I think it's kind of it's the, we'll make you a star kid thing, which works in all industries, but also, what they're offering infrastructurally is actually not that tremendous, which is, we have editors you can work with, which is hard to find. Audio editing is tough, but I feel like these days with TikTok, everyone, like teenagers, are becoming very good at video editing.
Yes,
so
absolutely,
it feels like the ability to edit is going to become much more innate than it used to be for adults entering the workforce. And then that they work with some kind of in-house ad network, and that they can get ads for your show, but they're also going to put too many ads on your show, and then your listeners will complain that every 8 minutes there's another ad for HelloFresh, and then you have to balance that. So it was this period, especially in 2021 and thereabouts, where I think the way that big business sees creativity, understandably for their ends, is that if something is trending, you have to jump on it and suck all the money you can get out of it as quickly as possible, and then kind of destroy the thing that you were trying to profit from, and then move on in about 18 months, which is nice, but it's the opposite of nice, but it's actually not serving anyone's ends, because the artist, loses custody of their work in most significant ways, and kind of often can lose track of why they started doing it to begin with, after the kind of compromises that you have to make in that situation. And then, the corporate view of how to monetize creative ideas will always fall behind the crest of the wave, because there's a general sense at the top of any platform and media that it's not enough to offer something that people will probably like. It has to be a duplicate of the last 3 things that have hit it as big as possible.
Right. And so, that kind of takes all the uniqueness out of it. A couple of things, and we're going to get to audience questions here in a couple of minutes, but I want to get in the fact that there's a wide array of topics that your podcast targets. So it's not, I mentioned human trafficking, and we were talking about all these different women that are maligned by the media and the public. They, of course, a OJ Simpson series. Have you done the Leopold and Loeb series yet? You mentioned it like multiple times.
No.
Okay,
I wanted to do it at the start of making this show, and I met someone recently who's a Leopold and Loeb scholar. I think I'm really going to do it next year.
Okay, cool. I'm excited. There's is it a 3-part series on Karen Carpenter?
It's just 2 parts,
Two
but they're
parts.
long parts. Yeah, it feels
Yeah.
like 3.
So, like that's one I haven't got to yet. And but I'm right now listening to the Fleetwood Mac episode, which is why I started playing it, because you love Fleetwood Mac, as you talked about. So there's a wide variety. It's not just, human trafficking and depressing stories about how women have been unfairly maligned. There's Disco Demolition Night, which Courtney recommended to me and I listened to, which I thought it opened my eyes. I vaguely knew about it. I was alive then, but I didn't realize the roots of it. But before we get to audience questions, I'd like you to talk about the things that you're working on that are coming up, because we talked about that when you and I spoke. You may have mentioned one of them already, Strange Phenomenon, which, nowadays my students know Kate Bush. I mentioned Kate Bush and running up that hill, and they know that from Stranger Things. So I'm like, oh, I'm very happy now because everybody should know Kate Bush. So you're working on this. Is it a book, The Strange Phenomenon?
Yeah. So it's
Or is it, is that the mini series on the Satanic Panic?
Yeah, this is Satanic Panic related.
Okay.
It's kind of part of that larger picture.
And that was originally going to be a book, right? Because you
Yes.
mentioned multiple times in the podcast that you're working on a book on the Satanic Panic. But when we talked,
Yeah.
you said it's going to be a mini series, a podcast mini series.
Yes. Well, this is the thing. That was in 2019 when I was, my brain still worked in ways that it doesn't really anymore. And I really have kind of lost the ability to write since the onset of the pandemic. So many things that used to supposed to be books are not anymore. But yeah, that's something that is going to come out at some point next year. And is, trying to approach the topic of the Satanic Panic, which is kind of a cultural event with many fronts that the last couple of years have made it clear that we never really left. It just kind of got quieter for a while, and the needs of media changed, and daytime talk shows changed the kind of guests they were trying to book, I guess. But that's trying to be an exploration where, we talk about this is a story of, justice gone wrong and wrongful conviction, and we know all that and we can express all that, but we also need to kind of make it a relatable phenomenon, and basically, I think, to me, one of the central questions is if we accept that people are not logical creatures fundamentally, that we are sort of fearful and superstitious and prone to forming mobs, and, that our guts get ahead of our brains and everything we can see in the way that we behave, then if we accept that, then what can we do, to create or structure society in a way that mitigates those problems, as opposed to every single time saying, oh my God, we really expected this district attorney to be a creature of pure logic.
Right. We're still huddling in the cave around the fire, although we want to think that we're past that.
Yeah, we're just in a skyrise with a cave with a fire in it on the top level.
Absolutely. So you're working on that. So it'll be a podcast series about satanic panics or moral panics around different news events or different trials or different situations. The Dungeons and Dragons caused those kids to go into the high school with their guns and hurt a bunch of people, that kind of stuff. And then you're also but you are still working on a book, because we talked about that, and that might be what we get to hear and experience with you later today.
Yeah, well, some new stuff, I think, but it's really, I'll probably use my talking brain to talk about the book thing, because that's where I'm still most comfortable. But yeah, for me, one of my projects next year is getting comfortable again with kind of the process of writing, because I think, one of the things that's always been most important to me about it is not just the products that you end up with when you're finished with a project you're working on, but the fact of, consistently whenever I write, if I can actually focus and kind of stay with it and sort of sit with what I'm thinking about, I will find myself writing things that I would be incapable of saying or thinking at any other time. And so I feel like something I'm trying to do, and I think probably many people already know to do and do already, is to see it as sort of something that allows me to go to a part of my brain that I like being in and I don't get to go to in other ways.
And so what is this writing gonna be about?
Yeah, this is a kind of towards a theory of the bimbo project, because bimbos have become sort of, to me, I used to say that the show was often about maligned women, but that's kind of a mouthful. And at the start of this year, I just started saying bimbos, and there's been kind of a big reclamation of the concept of the bimbo in the past couple of years, and people comfortably self-identifying as bimbos, which didn't used to be the case nearly to this extent. And that's, looking at some specific figures, but also looking at the general idea and, sort of the bimbo herself being someone who has failed to atone for the cardinal sin of being a woman by being really smart and really driven and really unfrivolous. And, the question being, what if we just didn't bother?
Right. And so you had was it a live show called the Attack of the 50-Foot Bimbo?
I did. Yeah.
Right. And so just to get the plug in, there's another live event coming up early next month, a massive seance down in Portland at the Aladdin Theater.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah. That looks like a really cool event. Also to just to say one thing and then open it to questions. When I was chatting with my wife about the concept of the bimbos in the book that you're working on, she was like, well, she'd been to the pizza place in Kalamazoo. We're from Kalamazoo, Michigan. There's a pizza place called Bimbo's. And I never really, and there's also a pizza place called Bilbo's, named after the Hobbit. It's this strange town with an obsession with B pizza places, but I never really connected it because I grew up there. That Bimbo's the pizza place and Bimbo's the slur, which maybe isn't a slur anymore. We're the same thing. And I wanted to go in and ask them, like, why did you name your pizza place this? Who are the bimbos?
Makes me wonder if, because like the word bimbo, like kind of migrated genders at a certain point, and through I think up until about the 40s or 50s, it meant like a strapping young baby.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh,
or just like, like was more applied to young men, and then it migrated over to women, I think really in the 60s. But we have to ask, when was the pizza place started and what was the intent?
Yes, it was it had been there a long time, so it could have been anything.
We stop one on the research trip.
Yeah, when I go back. So let's open it up to some audience questions. I'll give over my mic because I don't need to talk anymore. And yeah, please ask questions.
Well, I'm going to jump on here because longtime listener, first time asker. As somebody who has, done writing in the past and sort of moved away from it, I'm curious about this idea that you mentioned about, starting out as a writer and then moving into podcasts and feeling more comfortable in the audio medium or extemporaneous speaking. Do you feel that that's because of the sort of the inherent collaboration with it? Because you have great partnerships that you've worked with over the past few years. Is that something that, brings new energy into it?
Yeah, I think the collaborative thing is a big part of it, because I've always loved kind of working on writing projects with people. And, there is such joy in that. And also I think, in many ways it's just easier. And so of course, it makes sense to develop a preference for the easier thing, because what I love about the show, and there, now that most episodes have guests, like this can, it doesn't always work. Like it doesn't always gel. And sometimes you'll have a guest on who says, hello, thank you, get ready for my monologue. And then you just have to do with that what you can. But that, when it goes well, it feels like two people showing up and kind of bringing their knowledge and insight about a topic, but sort of collaborating to make something bigger than what each of them could do alone. And that feels really good. And then also, the other side of that is that as the show became really popular in 2020, which it did because suddenly it was providing the service that more people than previously really needed, which was to maybe learn something, but definitely like feel social energy coming from somewhere. That really wigged me out to suddenly feel sort of like known and seen, and like I was, skinny dipping at a swimming hole that there were only 14 people at, and suddenly I looked around and realized that the whole Astrodome was watching. and so I think that there was also for me like a sense of retreat from being seen entirely, and that, you know, if you're kind of showing up and working with somebody, you don't have to have the same kind of, you know, I think it takes a lot of bravery to simply express anything in writing because it's sort of unambiguously a part of you. And so, yeah, a combination of really loving teamwork and also being afraid.
Yeah, could you say a little more about this seance thing? Because when it when it comes to supernatural, I am a huge skeptic.
Yeah. Well, so are we. So this is a collaboration with a really great podcast called American Hysteria that's based in Seattle. And one of the things that Chelsea Weber Smith, the host of that show, kind of is passionate about is seance history and sort of the parlor tricks that people would use when holding seances in the spiritualist movement in the start of the 20th century. And so, you know, you would have mediums would produce ectoplasm that was supposed to come from the spirit world, and really it would just be like a jelly or something. Or there's, you know, tricks where you can slide your finger into like a hook and like make a table jump around because you're communicating with the spirits. And, you know, I think something I like about working with this subject matter is talking about, okay, like this is bunk. Like there are many stories about people, you know, producing sometimes very entertaining and theatrical fake supernatural events, but that there's also some kind of, I think, really genuine human need for ritual and for kind of gathering together and trying to honor at least some sense of kind of shared community for a moment. And so we will have a Fleetwood Mac tribute band there. And so the goal is to have somehow kind of a seance where the goal is to let go of this year and to sort of welcome in next year, and to do that as ghostily as possible, I guess.
Good morning. First of all, I apologize for being late, but
Oh, no worries.
you were talking about your writing brain, and I took a creative writing class years ago that said the professor had a theory that there's not the same censorship when you write compared to when you speak. Do you find that to be true?
So is the idea that it's sort of easier to kind of alter your thoughts on the page than to just kind of blurt them out? Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's true. I think that, I mean, I guess it definitely depends, but I feel like there are these sort of, at least for me, like moments in writing that are so wonderful where you're like writing and a completely insane sentence comes out of you and you're like, I'm never using that. And then you like look at it in the cold light of day and you're like, that's the only good part of the whole thing that I wrote. And that while speaking, it does feel like it's, yeah, I mean, there are, and then also that it's, you can potentially immediately backtrack and be like, never mind, let's not worry about it and kind of forget about it. And that you do, it's, yeah, the thing of both the kind of, freedom that you maybe feel in the moment and then having a record of it is so powerful, I think.
Do we have any other questions?
Hi, my mom and I are huge fans of You're Wrong About. I just wanted to say that. But what was your favorite episode of the show to do?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, in terms of the stuff that I presented, I have a real fondness for the Stepford Wives because that's kind of maybe the one that I did that has the most of a theory in it, which is, I think the Stepford Wives is about real history, and that it's about the history of women being over medicated and over, you know, given far too many sedatives by the pharmaceutical industry in the 60s to help them cope with the pains of not being liberated, and therefore maybe they just won't bother with it. And I like that one because it was like, I think we recorded that. Yeah, we recorded that in 2020. I remember sitting in my closet at my parents' house recording it, and it was like the feeling of like being in this time when nothing was going right and being able to make something that sort of felt coherent. And it's like, my brain really does work still. But yeah, so many of them are fun because of, you know, the guests that I get to have on and have this conversation with, and experience getting to know. I had Jamie Loftus on to talk about Ed and Lorraine Warren, and then about the Amityville Horror. And we did those episodes when we didn't really know each other particularly well, and now we're very good friends. And so like, there are also those episodes where you can you have weirdly a forensic record of a significant period in your life. So yeah, I think so many of them in different ways, but the Stepford Wives is kind of my personal idiosyncratic pick.
Well, there's something about hot dogs then apparently also with Jamie Loftus.
Yes.
This, champion hot dog eater, and there was a book, right? You were
Yeah.
talking about that. About
He
hot dogs.
has a book called Raw Dog, which is fantastic. It's like a road trip to eat as many significant American hot dogs as possible, and on like the history of hot dogs, which I love. I feel like I was thinking about this on the drive up here, because there's a new Burger King between Scappoose and St. Helens, I think. And I was like, are we so fancy that we cannot simply drive down to the Fred Meyer and go to that Burger King if we're in that orbit? But because kind of like, and it's clearly brand new, and like driving past this Burger King, seeing like the kind of corporate landscaping they do, and they have all these little trees that they planted to make the Burger King more pastoral, and just thinking about like, so much of what I find most interesting is like stuff that isn't going to get preserved in most museums because it's just ephemera. But it's like, and I went on this whole little like mental tangent thinking about calling Burger King corporate and being like, what kind of trees do you plant in your Burger Kings and why?
Pastoral Burger King would be a great band name. I want to thank you for coming, and I mean, speaking personally as like the resident historian here, for combining history and media criticism and the modern world and all these things together into such an accessible and listenable podcast. And just thank you all for coming and asking your questions. Thank you, Chris, for arranging this, and thank you, Sarah, for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you for everyone so much for coming.